Hi, this is Ajit Lenin. Welcome to the part 4 of the Enterprise Architecture video series. In the last video, we looked at the usage layer, which is the topmost layer of the Enterprise Architecture framework, the 6-layer framework to help us define Enterprise Architecture practices. On this video, we look at the second layer, which is the evolution layer, and look at why time is a dimension of the Enterprise Architecture. What are the components that will help us define that time as a dimension, and also some of the behavioral aspects or the requirements to help us bring in this time dependency. Okay, to start with, we'll see why time is important and why is time a dimension of the enterprise architecture, right? So if any enterprise or an enterprise architecture goes through evolution, right? It evolves continuously. Life of every component in the enterprise architecture is time bound, right? If an enterprise architecture is not evolving, that means we are not doing a good job about maintaining the enterprise architecture, right? The changes of an enterprise architecture could be either directly triggered by an external event or an internal event. It could be an internal event triggered by an internal reason, or an internal change that is triggered by an external internal change triggered by an external change, right? So on the bottom, I have a small picture which represents some of the key reasons why an enterprise architecture goes through the time-bound evolution, right? On the top are the internal reasons. It could be a change in business strategy. That means we need to care for new capabilities, new processes comes in, etc. Right? So that could be one reason, or introduction of a new product, or new process, or a new capability within the process itself. Right? So that also could drive changes. Or it could be an improvement in the policies. So there could be a new compliance policy that is introduced, or a product new change in the product process or capability. All this could derive changes in the enterprise architecture. Or it could be a merger of two companies or a spin-off. Those organizational changes also could trigger enterprise architecture changes. Or on an external perspective, there could be government policies or laws changes, right? Compliance requirements changes, so that could trigger new capabilities which needs enterprise architecture changes. Or it could be an evolution of business and technology standards. So there could be industry-wide standards or technology standards that could change, which needs new components in the enterprise architecture or changes in the components, right? So that could trigger changes. Emergence of new technologies and frameworks, that's a very important one. So any enterprise have to watch out for new things that comes in the market, right? So anytime new technology advancement comes, all right, enterprise architecture has to change to adapt to it, right? And also competitive changes in the market that could trigger changes in the organization, which could in turn bring in change into enterprise architecture. Now let's look at the three components I'm defining that could help us define time as a dimension, right? How do we represent the dependency with time in the enterprise architecture, right? Three components that could help us, right? So those are roadmaps, transitions, and the blueprints, right? So roadmap, let's look at roadmap, right? Roadmap is basically, the term itself is self-explanatory. So it has well-defined lifespan, right? It has got multiple well-defined stages or phases, right? Artifacts can have more than one version. So across phases, we can reuse the same version of an artifact, or the a version changes. Same version of an artifact can change across the phases. The important thing for a roadmap, right? So roadmap can be extended or abandoned, right? So when I say extended, so say we defined an roadmap which takes us from a state one to say state two with say whatever business benefits we are looking for that transition. We could extend that to another state, right? So because as the business evolves, we may have to move forward and further on the roadmap, right? Or we could abandon the roadmap because it doesn't align with the business strategy anymore. We could abandon it and start a fresh roadmap, right? So that's the key features of a roadmap. When you look at the transition is just a state of a very short lifespan, right? And it can be attached to a roadmap. It can be a state in between the phases or stages of two stages within the roadmap, right? Transition, being a temporary state, it may not bring in any business benefits. And then it includes artifacts from the roadmap. It's part of the roadmap, right? And transition one important phase we saw, roadmaps can be extended or abandoned, but transitions cannot be extended or abandoned. It is it's supposed to be a temporary life state, right? So it can only be overridden with another transition or another solid state, or it can be reverted, right? So we find that the transition is not working for us, so we can always revert back to the previous good state, or we could move to the next transition state or the next solid state within a roadmap or an evolution, right? Let's look at the third one, the blueprint. So blueprint is basically a representation of state of an enterprise at any specific moment in the time, right? So it basically it has an time of creation. So we have to basically record it saying that this is a blueprint created at this particular day and time, whatever it is, right? And current blueprint, whatever we do today, will be valid till the next blueprint is published, right? So it has no versioning concepts coming in, but it's more of a recording of the state as is at a particular moment of time, right? Blueprint cannot be abandoned or reverted because it's not a transition. It is what it is, right? So it can only be revised with another blueprint, right? So these are the basic structures of these components. We will look at them each one in a little more brief, right? So in the bottom, I have just a small pictorial representation of whatever I explained so far, right? So we have a roadmap which goes through phases, like across the phases, and transitions are states in between those phases. And blueprints are just representation of the enterprise at a specific point of time, right? Now let's look at roadmap in more detail, right? So roadmaps can be created at any architecture level. So it could be an enterprise level roadmap, it could be a segment level roadmap, or it could be at a capability level also. Or roadmaps can be functional as well. So it can be a roadmap for a particular business service where we introduce new capabilities within the business service across the time, or it could be a process, right? So it could be a process transformation roadmap. It could be a simple capability transformation roadmap as well, right? And roadmap can be broken down hierarchically. So if I am defining a roadmap at an enterprise level, it can be broken down into what is the corresponding roadmap each segment has to go through, right? So, and underneath that, we can even have a roadmap for each capability, how each capability goes through a roadmap to accomplish the higher level roadmap, right? And key features of a roadmap is each phase or a state is a stable state. So, and each state or a phase would bring in significant business benefit, right? So that's where when we looked at in the previous slide, we said that roadmap can be abandoned. So at any point of time, we should be able to abandon a roadmap, saying that it's no longer valid because of whatever changes in the organization. But the state as it exists now, the phase it is in, it is still valid, right? So it can exist in that phase. It still delivers good enough business benefits for it, right? So if a particular phase is not delivering any significant business benefit, then it is not a real phase of a roadmap, right? It has to be really a transition state for us, right? So that's the primary thing when we define a phase or a state, we have to be careful, right? Artifacts required is based on what the purpose of the roadmap. Are we representing an enterprise roadmap or a segment or a capability or a function, right? So artifacts differ. What artifacts we represent within the roadmap, right? Each phase or state is an aggregation of specific versions of the components that are changing, right? So that's pretty much true for all components, right? So on the bottom, just a simple picture to represent the hierarchical nature of the roadmap, where we have an enterprise level roadmap broken down into segment level roadmap, which can be further broken down into capability level roadmap. And then roadmaps also can be independent. If it's a functional roadmap, we can have business service roadmap, process, or capability roadmaps, right? It can need not be hierarchical, but it can be built as a hierarchical structure as well. Moving to transitions, right? So transitions, basically the purpose of a transition is to help us to manage the complexity, right? When we move from one stage to another state, right? if that transition is complex, right, we should be able to define transition states in between, right? So that helps us to take incremental steps forward, right? So that's the primary purpose. So transition states need not give us any significant benefit compared to the previous state, right? It can sometimes it can give us incremental benefits, but it need not, right? And if it is delivering as a significant benefit, then where we can actually abandon the roadmap, then that is actually should be defined as a phase, not as a transition. Right? And transitions could be on a part of a roadmap, or it could be just a transition of a single component which is going through its evolution, right? So it could be a part of a bigger roadmap or a single component itself. Key thing is transitions. If a transition is surviving beyond the time period or a lifespan we defined, right, then that should create an alert, and it should trigger the enterprise to revert back, right? So if the transition is continuing for a longer period of time, that means there is something wrong with the transition journey itself, right? So we should better revert it back to the previous good state and then do a fresh roadmap, right? So that's a key aspect we need to look at. Again, artifacts depends on what we are representing, what component we are representing. And key other aspect is transition states are not reusable components, right? So a transition defined should not be reused. Roadmaps could be reused. So I can define a roadmap for a particular component. I can reuse it across components, right? Similar components, I should be able to reuse roadmaps, but transition should not be reused, right? Because of its temporary in nature, right? And bottom picture represents whatever I talked about. So we can have reuse transitions as transition states between a roadmap, between phases of a roadmap, or we could represent the transition as just a evolution of a component, right? When the component moves from one version to another, we could use an intermediary version as a transition state. Right? Moving to blueprints, right? So blueprint again can be created at any architecture level, yeah, enterprise level, segment level, or capability level, and it can be functional blueprints as well. So which can represent a business service or a process or a capability. Right? So blueprints are generated on need basis, right, or driven by a governance policy, right? So whenever we need something, we need a blueprint, we should be able to create the blueprint based on the components, the current state of the components, right? So blueprints is always a representation of reality. It is not a proposal or something that we are working towards. It is always represents the reality at a specific point of time, right? So why do we need blueprints, right? It is obviously it is useful to provide an overview of our current state, right, at whatever level it is, or blueprints are required for preparing a roadmap. So before we start a transformational roadmap, right, it is important that we have a blueprint of what we have, and then plan the roadmap. Similarly, once we finish the transformation, right, once our roadmap is completed, we should take a blueprint to understand where we are, right? Did we actually achieve what we wanted to achieve, right? And blueprints sometimes are required for conducting governance reviews, right? So for a governance compliance or a governance or a compliance checks, we need to know what it is currently, right? So we should be able to create a blueprints for those purposes. It is very important that when we define a blueprint or capture a blueprint, we should capture the realized KPIs as part of the blueprint. So that gives us the actual picture and helps us in, especially in the transformation programs, when we need to know what it is currently so that we can plan what KPIs are we addressing in the roadmap, right? On the bottom, I have represented, it's a simple representation of where and all blueprints can be used, right? So it could be a starting point of a roadmap, and after a roadmap, or it could be because of a specific need like a governance review. Now we will quickly look at the behavioral aspects. So some of the few behavioral aspects, typical change management functions, right? We should be able to version the components. There should be a state management and lifecycle management capabilities. We should be able to track changes, alerts and escalations, as we saw in the transition. Whenever if it leaves beyond its life cycle, we should be able to alert and create an escalation out of it, right? So those are the typical behavioral aspects which we should go into as a requirement when we get to the lower levels of this framework, right? To summarize, so time is a dimension of enterprise architecture. So we looked at why it is that, and we saw external and internal events could trigger changes in the architecture. We looked at roadmaps, which is basically phase-wise, so defined with a phase-wise multiple phases with defined lifespan, or it could be and we looked at transitions where it's temporary stages or phases between. For it can be for roadmaps or simple component changes, or it could be, or the other component we looked at is blueprints, which is a representation of the architecture or component at a specific moment of time, right? And we quickly broadly looked at the behavioral aspects due to the change management across the time. Right? In the next video, we will look at the next layer, which is the breadth and depth layer. Thank you.